So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our panel sponsored by the Amsterdam Law and Technology Institute at VU Amsterdam. My name is Dr. Mark Leiser from the VU, and I'm privileged to moderate this panel of distinguished speakers who are some of the leading voices in design and legal regulation. Having published on deceptive design myself, sharing this space with some of the best thinkers on design, law, and regulation is a real honor for me as well. Just a very quick disclaimer, there's a couple of people on the panel who are speaking in a personal capacity. I need to kind of stress that they're not representing their employers in any way. And we also have a small change to our program from one of the published speakers, Alo, who was unable to join us for personal reasons, has been suitably replaced, if that's the right word. Apologies if it's not, by Anne-Jel Hoelen from the Dutch Consumer Authority. I wanted to open with a few remarks before we're getting into the panel discussion about deceptive design. And I'm going to integrate my introductions of the speakers through these remarks. So bear with me, because we're going to take a little bit of a different approach in how this panel will operate from maybe some of the others that you've seen at CPDP. So back in 2010, a designer and design ethicist, I don't know if you'll forgive me for saying that, but Harry Brignull, who is joining us online, coined the term dark patterns and defined it as a user interface that has been carefully crafted to trick users into doing things such as buying insurance with their purchase or signing up for recurring bills. And 13 years later, countless examples of deceptive design have been identified. Regulators have begun to take notice. And considerable academic scholarship from a variety of fields has been written about how online interfaces can be designed in a way that benefits the platform at the expense of user autonomy and rational thinking, and on occasion can result in individual and systematic harms. And arguably, we may be saying, or we could argue that this is the kind of end of the first wave of deceptive design regulation, involving cross-discipline scholarship from experts in HCI, choice architecture, consumer and data protection around deceptive design. And for the purposes of today's panel, I'd like to posit that we're entering a second wave of thinking about manipulation beyond the online interface to deception that is powered by either A, algorithmic deceptive design implemented by in the system architecture by AI systems and algorithmic personalization, etc. And B, more nuanced forms of deceptive design integrated in non-traditional devices that don't have a surface, like a keyboard or a phone. And no one in the EU is more suitable to discuss, or suited to discuss this, than my colleague, Dr. Silvia de Conca at the VU, who's been working tirelessly to examine the way deceptive design is implemented into non-traditional computer devices, like smart speakers and home assistants, and whose work focuses primarily on deceptive design in the Internet of Things. And the conclusion of the first wave has broadened the oversight of deceptive design, moving it beyond the exclusive purview of the first wave of the EDPS and data protection regulators. And now we have dark patterns which are prohibited as misleading practices under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, and even now on the blacklist there of the UCPD as well. We now see specific mention of the term dark patterns in guidance documents to assist data protection, consumer protection authorities in applying the UCPD. And we now have further regulation of patterns in distinct situations within several critical pieces of legislation, including the AI Act, the Data Act, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. And now I'll plug my new paper with Cristiana Santos, who's just sitting on the down front here, where we outline what this emerging digital design acquis looks like. And while the DSA introduces critical provisions around risk assessments, audits, risk mitigation, and its applicability is restricted mainly to very large online platforms and very large search engines. So the distinction underlines regulators' challenges in ensuring comprehensive oversight and enforcement of rules meant to prevent deceptive design across platforms, regardless of size, to protect all consumers in the digital marketplace. And by focusing primarily on the larger platforms, smaller entities that might employ dark patterns could circumvent these otherwise stringent regulatory requirements. And so the focus on giants like Amazon and Google may be practical in many respects, giving their substantial influence over EU citizens and ample resources to shoulder the regulatory burden. However, this approach generates a counter-narrative that exposes a potential gap in regulation and clearly enforcement. So to make light of how the DSA will regulate deceptive design, I'm honored to introduce my friend and sometimes colleague Martin Husovec from the London School of Economics, who is also joining us online. And while Martin will navigate us through one aspect of the legal framework of the EU, there is no sense in having law unless we have meaningful and practical enforcement. And no national regulator is more at the forefront of enforcement than the Dutch Authority for Consumers and Market. And joining us to help make light of movements of enforcement actions against companies and to outline some of the challenges thereof in regulating businesses that deploy deceptive design is Anne-Jel Hoelen from the Dutch ACM. So the panel is going to follow in the following format. Rather than having talk and then move on, we're going to have a conversation, and I'm going to engage the panelists with questions. And hopefully now Harry could be put up on the screen and join us online. Hi, Harry.
Hey, everyone. Hey, am I okay? The audio okay?
Yes. Can you hear us?
Yep.
Great. So as the first thing I want to do is kind of go back to this point that I was raising earlier in my opening remarks about moving away from traditional forms and of interfaces to surface-free interfaces in the field of apps, AI systems, profiling, behavioral advertising, and consumer transactions. How do you see the responsibility of designers changing concerning the potential for creating deceptive designs embedded within the system architecture?
Yeah, well, I mean, if we just rewind for a moment, the idea of deception happening at the user interface is something that I originally championed. I put forward with darkpatterns.org, and in hindsight, I think it was a little bit of a mistake. I mean, at the time I worked in an interface design consultancy. It was my career, so I really overemphasized the interface, and a lot of other people have done so subsequently as well. Some types of interface are static, like a plain HTML page on the web is the same for everyone who looks at it wherever they are, whenever they look at it. It's like a printed page. But today, most interfaces are dynamic. They're the front end of a piece of software, software that has all sorts of funky personalization and recommendation algorithms. So, I mean, if you think about a social media app that has a feed you scroll through, the feed itself, the interface is quite neutral and really rather boring. You'll have a rectangle component that will have a piece of content like a video or a picture or some text, and you'll have the means to like, comment, or share or post. So there's nothing to it, really. It's kind of, if anything, a little bit boring. The interesting bit is the recommendation algorithm, which can do wonderful things or harmful things, depending on how it's programmed. So I think we do need to shift our focus from about deception from the user interface to the entire system. When I started working on this stuff, I came up with some terminology that describes deception at the user interface level. Then some years later, someone launched darkpatterns.games, which provides terminology for deception in video games. And the concepts are related, obviously, because it's human psychology, but it's also very different for games. So I think the concepts are going to be different again for all the new technology that we're looking at now. So stuff to do with algorithmic harms and LLMs and AI bots and all the rest of it. So I think this is what we need from designers and architects and engineers in industry. We need them to tell us what's going on behind closed doors in their companies. And more importantly, we need them to equip us with the concepts, language, and understanding to reason about this stuff.
So it sounds like that you think, well, maybe rephrase the question. Do you think that designers should take more responsibility for the things that they're designing?
Well, I mean, it's common to assume that designers have a lot more control than they really do in real life. The design of a piece of software is the embodiment of the business model. And by the time a piece of work gets to a designer or an engineer, an architect, or whatever kind of worker, at that point, the business strategy has usually already been defined, and they're left with relatively small tactical decisions. From my experience, I think designers usually are consumer advocates. They're taught to design things using human-centered processes and techniques, and many of them want to design ethical, user-friendly things, but they are often just not given the opportunity.
So what do you think employers could do to stop, or what can designers do to stop employers from delivering these type of deceptive products then?
Well, I know there's been some instances of things like resignations and walkouts in tech, but that's usually focused on really big issues like weapons and defense and contracts with hostile governments, that sort of thing. But with deceptive patterns, it's not usually the sort of thing that people want to lose their jobs over. So you can, an employee, a designer, whoever, they can raise the issue, they can complain and go up the org chart until they find someone in power. Sometimes that will work and other times it won't. Other than that, your options are quite limited. I mean, that's pretty much why I started the campaign, or one of the reasons why I started the campaign against deceptive patterns, to give designers a bit more clout and a bit more power. I wanted them to be able to say to their bosses, we shouldn't do this, it'll be bad for our reputation. Look at these other companies who have been ridiculed and named and shamed. And I also had hoped that a code of ethics would help. I hoped that designers would be able to say, we can't do that because I'm a member of this particular professional body and it's against our code of ethics. But that has not worked. It hasn't worked at all, right? I mean, deceptive patterns today are now worse than ever, and I think it's an undisputed fact. That said, we have achieved a lot. Like, deceptive patterns in the user interface are now fairly well understood. We've got new laws and regulations. We've got progress. But as I said before, we focus on the user interface, and that's not enough for the next generation of tech, which is like all these enormously complex systems and AI and all the rest of it.
So, but from a design perspective, I mean, I know you're the designer speaking to a room of kind of lawyers and people working in the field, but what's different from a design perspective about these new technologies then?
Well, I mean, perhaps it's an obvious point to start off with, but complex systems can have a lot more hidden inside them because they're complex. They've got lots of nooks and crannies to hide things. I mean, some modern systems are so complicated that lots of workers don't have the perspective to understand the whole thing that they're working on or the kinds of harms that it might be causing. I work in financial services, and there are some parts of the business that I don't understand. So I put my trust in the other teams and in the leadership to make sure those aspects of the business are run fairly. I would expect the same to be the same with businesses that provide very AI-heavy services to consumers. So when software gets very complex, employees will struggle to perceive whether there are harms occurring. And independent experts might struggle too. But I think there's a big difference between finance that is heavily regulated and this next generation of AI service that are going to be sprinkled across many different industries, like everywhere, that probably are not as regulated. Now, if I might digress a little bit about voice assistants, because I've got some opinions I'd love to share. I think voice assistants are going to be a sort of a glue that connects together a lot of this new stuff for consumers. And I know they've been around for years. We've all got one of these hockey puck devices sitting somewhere at home gathering a bit of dust. But so far, they've been a bit dumb. And I think that's going to change, and you're going to have much better AI in them, and they will be an interface to everything else. So it'll be home lighting, security, entertainment systems, and so on. And the thing about these voice assistants is they're just much less neutral than web browsers. So, if you open up Firefox or Safari, you can access the entire web, and that's what it's designed for. So you have many businesses at your fingertips. Also, the job of a search engine is to connect you with those businesses and make some ad revenue along the way. So that's a very kind of open market kind of a model. But with a voice assistant, if you ask a question, you usually want just one good answer because voice is slow and it takes time to listen to the response. And you have to put your trust in the provider. You're treating it like an assistant or a concierge or a teacher. And that is abusable because instead of giving user options, the business is probably going to want to pick the answer that profits them the most, and it'll respond with that. So voice assistants tend to be built as walled gardens where the user is steered towards products and services that are owned by their provider. So I think voice assistants are going to get a lot more useful to consumers soon, and it's going to be pretty cool. Like the old thing you've got in whatever the corner of your bedroom gathering dust is suddenly going to become really useful because it have amazing AI in it. You won't have to buy anything new, but it's not neutral technology, and it lends itself to a very walled garden model, which I think is worrying. Another thing to bear in mind is that if a provider is required to allow interoperability, all they really need to do is just make it ever so slightly more inconvenient to connect and use third parties, to connect with and use those third parties, because the power of convenience is really, really huge. For example, I use my Amazon Kindle a lot, and I know I can sideload books that I buy from other stores, but you know what? I think I've only done it once because it's just a little bit fiddly. It's not hard, drag and drop something as if it's an external disk. So it's not hard. It just has a few more steps. And my point is that if the experience of setting up or using a third party is even very slightly frustrating or difficult, it'll have a big effect on whether people bother using it. So it'll be interesting to see how any new regs I'm not sure which one it is, the DSA or the DMA, who regulate has bits about interoperability DMA. And dark patterns. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the next few years, because very slight inconvenience would have to be construed as deceptive in this context. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Harry. Yeah. So, Dr. de Conca, I'm going to hand it over to you because your work is on these type of devices that Harry has. I think abusable was a nice word that sums up some of the challenges. But beyond abusable, what sort of peculiarities are there about Internet of Things, surface-free devices, and how do they differ from what we're already seeing and have experienced in screen-based?
Yes. Thanks, Mark. And thanks, Harry, for introducing a bit the peculiarities of voice assistants or virtual assistants. Well, obviously, Internet of Things devices are many, and they come in many forms, and many are just going to have an app to operate them through the phone or a display. Or, as the most common Internet of Things actually sold in Europe and North America, they're going to have a remote control, because that's a smart TV, actually. But I focused on voice assistants because of the vocal interaction. And that is definitely different from what we are used with a display or a screen, because it has two main characteristics, identified also very well by Owens and his team of researchers at University of Washington, and these are linearity and volatility. So linearity means that when I am talking to Alexa, Google Assistant, or Siri, I need to wait until they have finished their sentence and they have completed and said everything they were supposed to say. And then I can give another command, or I can exit the interaction, or I can try and turn them off. And volatility, well, this is well known since the Romans, that the written things remain and the spoken words flies away. And so right after the assistant has said something to the user must make sure to have remembered everything the assistant has said. And whenever we try and make a phone call, and then we need to remember which number, when we have a pre-recorded message and we need to remember which number select, I think we can all agree that volatility can be a problem, because we might not actually remember what has been said before accurately. And most important, respect to a page or a web page, we cannot scroll back, or we cannot turn the pages back and reread. We have to open the app on our phone, pull up the log of the recording, and re-listen to the whole recording. So volatility and linearity can become vehicles for deceptive design. They can be leveraged very easily by the designers. And there are cases of extreme malicious leverages that I want to specify have been recorded by research, and they are not made by neither Amazon nor Google, but developers making apps for a smart speaker. And what happens is that when certain malicious apps were downloaded, the users would open the app through Alexa, for example, and the app would take control of Alexa so that the user could only subscribe to a service and couldn't even stop the conversation, when normally you can order Alexa to stop. So this is a classic example of how this can be leveraged. And one thing I really want to stress is that in the case of voice assistants specifically, you can no longer separate the machine learning and the way the service is organized and delivered to the person with the interface. Because if you decide to intervene on the vocal interaction and stop certain forms of vocal interactions, you will lose functionality. So the trade-off is quite extreme in this sense, and the risk of over or under inclusiveness or regulation is quite high.
So how do you envisage these devices, these types of devices, compromising our fundamental rights? I mean, beyond the sort of traditional data protection.
Yeah, obviously, privacy and data protection are quite high on the list, not just because that's what I'm specialized into, but most of these devices are in the home. So while the expectation of privacy is very high, there are certain phenomena, like, for example, the fact that these devices might migrate to the peripheral vision of the users, even though the users have bought and installed them. Or the fact that the users migrate to the peripheral vision means that at some point you forget that certain devices have certain sensors. It's normalized for you until it might come and bite you back because all of a sudden, because of a mistake, your Alexa has sent an entire conversation that was recorded to one of your contact list. Example of actually something that really happened, and it's a famous case of a family in Oregon. So, and these devices, most IoT devices look just like their dumb counterparts. So you don't expect the device to collect as many data, and this is happening right in one of the sanctuaries of our private sphere, which is the home. But one thing that I have noticed working with them is that the freedom of information and expression is also not to underestimate, because especially some devices that have the display with the vocal assistant, and I'm thinking of one of the Alexa devices, the Echo devices with display, they can prompt users mixing both voice and images, and they invite users to try something. Try ask me for a recipe, try ask me for a joke. Or they can show news and say, try tell me more about this news. Now, Amazon really cares about highlighting how neutral Alexa is. But if Alexa, close to an election, starts showing news about, let's say, climate change, that is not a neutral topic. And arguably, very few topics are neutral. I come from Italy, not even recipes are neutral. So it's not necessarily the walled garden effect can start happening even with the news. And let's not forget that obviously there can be certain conflicts of interest, like the owner of Amazon also owning a major news outlet in the US. And there's been a research in 2019 that I found quite interesting that started asking political questions like, Alexa, are you a Republican or a Democrat? American system. And Alexa replied, when it comes to politics, I think big. I want to explore Mars. And the owner of Amazon also owns an aerospace company. So as I said, the facade of neutrality might not necessarily be there, which means that through deceptive design, actually, the freedom of information might also be affected.
Okay. So let's go back to this point, though, because we kind of glossed over the data protection regime in my preceding question. But let's go back to data protection for a second. How, because there's several principles that appear to be compromised right off the bat, but how are these companies using these devices complying with the EU data protection framework?
I mean, as well as they comply with the data protection regime in all their other services, because this is one of the 50, 60, 18 services that they provide together, and they all have the same umbrella privacy policy. And especially in the case of Google, where the business model of Google Home, experts tend to agree, is still data broker, while we don't have the business model of Alexa clear, which is slightly more confusing. So in this case, I would say that the same level of protection that you can expect by Google as a search engine, you can expect from the Google Home or Google Assistant, and the same level of protection you can expect by Amazon on the web shop, you will expect on Alexa. They are fully integrated, which personally, I think there is ample room for improvement in both of them.
Okay. And can you discuss then, because it sounds like some of the examples you're giving kind of activate the consumer protection regime. How do you see the Alexa's role inside that acquis?
Yes, especially with Alexa, because of the connection with the Amazon online, on the e-commerce, right? So some of the things that have been recorded that I have flagged as, including to Marie and Anne-Jel, do raise concerns with consumer protection because, as Eri was pointing out, if I ask Alexa, I want to buy a blender, Alexa is only going to tell me about an Amazon Choice product. And Amazon Choice products are products that it's not clear how Amazon selects. Amazon usually only disclose 3 criteria. For example, the number, the how many stars they have in the review, or the number of returns in the same trader, in the same seller. And all the Amazon Choice products seems to belong to Prime. Now, if I want to sell a product through Prime, I need, as a seller, I need to subscribe to the Fulfilled by Amazon program. For example, in the Netherlands, I would pay either 19 cents per product sold or a fixed rate of 39 euros per month. Now, there I envision not only clear consumer protection issues with dark patterns, because the linearity and volatility together with the personalization means that there is price consumer prevention. They're just telling me the blender costs 44.99 euros. Okay, and what about other brands at other prices? And what about the delivery cost? And what about my right to send it back within 30 days? All information that under the UCPD and the Consumer Rights Directive should be provided. But we know that certain information to consumers cannot be provided if there are limitations of means for space or time. And then the question becomes, with voice interaction, where is the threshold? How many information are sufficient considering the specific characteristics of voice interface? And obviously, this same one product under the Amazon fulfillment program also raises questions of competition, which indirectly also goes to affect consumers naturally, and then the other traders. So data protection with the constant profiling and the data collection, and consumer protection with those smart speakers that are used primarily for groceries or hands-free purchases are quite high on the list of concerns.
Sure. So it sounds like, if I was reading, that we have the potential for regulation, which might not be living up to expectations for regulation, particularly through data protection regime. And like, as you said, what you get with Alexa is what you get with Amazon and other places, and what you get with Google is what you see in other Google products. And then all of a sudden we have this wonderful thing that comes to our fruition called the Digital Services Act. And you would think from the wording of Article 25, which I'm going to put up on the screen very quickly from the slide presentation. So I'm going to be referring to this article here, which has now disappeared.
It's coming, 1 second.
Coming. There we go. Article 25 appears to have a prohibition on dark patterns. It's even referred to as a prohibition in subsection 2 of Article 25. And then I'm going to go now to talk to Martin Husovec from the LSE, who is our panel's expert in the Digital Services Act. So, Martin, if you're now available online.
Sure.
Okay.
Hi, Mark.
Good. Hi, Martin. Thank you for joining us. Can you give us some insights into how Article 25 of the DSA regulates and works to mitigate deceptive design?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, it's very complex, and thanks a lot for those previous presentations. I'm certainly not an expert on dark patterns as all the other colleagues, but looking at the Article 25 of the DSA, which was not in the original proposal of the European Commission, it was introduced in the legislative process, mostly thanks to the European Parliament. You can see that the difficulty with applying this provision is right in the second paragraph, because second paragraph basically hollows out large chunks of the situations where Article 25 would apply. Why is that? Because basically Article 25.1 says there's a broad prohibition of manipulation or deceptive practices. And then 25.2 says, well, except for the situations where are already covered by GDPR or Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, and for those prohibitions, they're not covered by Article 25. Now, what does that mean and why that was introduced? It was introduced because there was a worry that we will sort of layer on top of each other several enforcement systems. So you would have something that violates consumer laws or data protection laws, and it would at the same time violate also DSA, and hence you would have two regimes at the same time basically enforcing the same prohibition. So to avoid that, it was split. The baby was split, but the result is that 25 really was hollowed out. Because if you think about, our conversation, most of the dark patterns we're thinking about were B2C, right? Where the platform is a business and the person manipulated is a consumer. Well, most of the B2C situations where the platform is a trader and the consumer, the user, is a consumer, are covered by the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. So as a result, a lot of B2C scenarios basically fall out of the realm of Article 25, which leaves you with the strange situation that Article 25 has application for mostly B2B scenarios. And even there is a little bit of a footnote, because Unfair Commercial Practices Directive harmonizes even B2B scenarios with this impact on consumer. So as a result, this provision gives you more of a signal than really much of a teeth. Having said that, I think it gives us powerful signal that changes to some extent how we think about risk mitigation, risk management of very large online platforms. Because one thing to keep in mind is Article 25 is about online platforms, regardless of whether they're VLOPs, right? So if you're an online platform, meaning you host content that you distribute to the public as your main function, and you're operated by a company that is at least mid-sized, meaning 10 million euros turnover or 50 employees, then you're an online platform and you're subject to this prohibition. Now, clearly, consumer law is much broader than that. But if you become a VLOP, and I think that's your second question, so I'll save it for that. I think the remit for dark patterns actually opens up, despite the limits of Article 25. And I think there maybe Article 25 is a signal. But for regular online platforms that are not VLOPs, Article 25 is a really strange beast, because most of it is hauled out in favor of consumer law. And that means that you cannot actually apply it in many situations where you would think about dark patterns, meaning B2C.
Okay. So going back to this point that you raised earlier about the role of risk regulation that's embedded inside the Digital Services Act. I know you and I have spoken a couple of times before about the role of risk and the regulating that risk. And there's two particular measures within the DSA that I want to talk about with you. The first is the risk assessment process that within the framework of the DSA and its role regulating design practices. So if maybe you could talk a little bit about what risk assessment means in the DSA and how that might apply beyond the prohibition in Article 25.
Yeah, so one thing to note, and that's quite interesting if you juxtapose it with the previous debate, is that the risk assessment by the DSA applies to own design of services as well as how the services are being run on the back end, including algorithmic systems, as well as how the services are being used. So if you think about that remit, that is much broader than any surface of a software that is the primary target of Article 20 to 25. That allows you to really kind of bring in to the risk assessment remit basically all the problems that were debated, because hardly anything is not a backend operation, design operation, or a behavior of a user. It's very hard to imagine something that doesn't qualify. So that means that potentially all practices could be on the radar. Now, the big second question you have to overcome is, okay, so are the risks that stem from dark patterns relevant for the risk assessment? And there again, if you look at the Article 34 one, you see that consumer interest, which are enshrined in the EU Charter for Fundamental Rights, are one of the interests that should be taken into account. In other words, through the fundamental right of consumers, you're introducing assessment of consumer interest in this risk mitigation. So the result is basically anything that a platform does within the regulated service needs to be checked against the consumer interest, whatever that means, right? And I think whatever that means is exactly where the fun starts, because then you think about, okay, so what exactly interests are the priority for the DSA? And this is, I think, where indirectly Article 25 receives certain usefulness, because then you see, okay, well, Article 25 tells us that it's the manipulation and aggressive practices that we're really concerned about when it comes to consumers. And it allows you to bring them into the risk assessment as one of the things that the company should be looking at. That basically means that within your periodical review of how you run the service, and one of the things that you should be looking at, next to all sorts of other things, like how you impact, what's the impact of hate speech on your platform and stuff like that. You should be also looking at what's the impact on consumers, what's the impact of the design, what's the impact of the backend operations on the consumers, and that's obviously very broad. So it will be very interesting to watch how companies operationalize it. But through the risk assessment, actually, I think the DSA does much more for the solution, delivers much more of a solution for deceptive and manipulative practices than Article 25. Article 25 is really not so useful on its own.
So on the other sort of heading of risk that we need to talk about inside of dark patterns is the risk mitigation measures that can be implemented through the DSA. Can you talk a little bit about them and how you imagine that they might apply to the context in the context of Article 25 and deceptive design?
Yeah, so I mean, look, I view this risk management system as a kind of a regulatory dialogue between companies, the auditors and the regulators. So basically, companies, design the services in a particular way, and then have to analyze what exactly is happening, what type of risks the design is creating, the use of the service is creating, and how they actually respond to that. And then, auditors might have their own views, the regulators might have ultimately their own views. One thing to, I think, state up front is I don't think there's one and the only answer to how to resolve this. So if you have some, interface where you are obviously trying to nudge your consumers to buy a particular product, I don't think there's a the answer to how you need to mitigate potential manipulation. So it will be always about a range of acceptable behaviors. And I think this is where, of course, many other areas of law, such as consumer law or data protection law, will be also delivering their own answers, right? We already see this with the EDPS and their own idea about what exactly constitutes the manipulative and deceptive practices in the context of data protection law. So ultimately, we might end up with something like what was already mentioned by Harry, is that you will have some sort of guidance about, for designers, what sort of things are generally seen as problematic, right? Because it's easier to say what is problematic rather than what isn't. And then basically one of the risk mitigation measures could easily be, well, look, our designers are certified to be part of this ethics sort of scheme, and they looking at all these guidelines, they're following what is happening there. It's like, yeah, sure, something can go wrong, but we're generally trying to put this in the system when we're designing our system. So I could imagine something like this being part of this. changes, and actually that could alleviate the compliance risk for the companies, and that could be structurally useful. So Harry's scheme could easily be introduced as a part of a mitigation strategy by the companies. But the interesting bit would be, and this is, I found the conversation about this sort of a threshold for manipulation really interesting in different settings and different interfaces, because one thing that would be really interesting to watch is how do we distinguish between manipulation of consumers and manipulation of businesses? Because keep in mind, Article 25 is not about consumers only. Neither is the risk management. So do we expect the same kind of behavior from an average consumer as we do from an average business that is using these services, or do we have different standards? And I think that will be quite fascinating. There's obviously nothing in the law, so it's all up for us to develop, and it will be fascinating to watch.
So following on from Dr. de Conca's earlier comments about the kind of harms that are associated with the sort of surface-free technologies and moving into sort of new forms of this deceptive design in those type of hardware, we seem to have at least some possibility for sort of systematic or even regulation through the risk mitigation and risk assessment processes of the DSA. But there's also some elements of private enforcement built into the DSA. So can you comment very quickly on private enforcement against platforms that are using dark patterns?
Yeah, so I mean, this one is a little bit complicated, but what I would say is that when it comes to risk mitigation, the enforcement there is mostly for the public enforcer, for the European Commission, and that's the nature of the beast. If you want to have a regulatory dialogue, you cannot have then courts chipping in and saying, well, I think you could have done this. It's different for Article 25, although it has this limited scope. But perhaps it doesn't matter all that much, because one of the things that the DSA introduces is it links the DSA, all due diligence obligations, with the directive on collective redress for consumers. And that's a separate directive, basically, that creates a scheme for collective redress for consumer bodies. And DSA is added to the list, but other instruments are on the list, including Unfair Commercial Practices Directive and GDPR. So given that, if you base your standing on that directive, it won't actually matter all that much if what you're enforcing is a deceptive practice on the basis of either of the three provisions. And of course, it will matter on the substance, but in terms of the standing, it will be less of an issue. Now, beyond collective redress, it's even more complicated because DSA doesn't speak too much to the private claims. It does mention damages, but basically damages are up to the national law to create. So these type of scenarios with limited application of Article 25, I generally think are not necessarily going to be very impactful when it comes to the DSA. One exception perhaps might be if we interpret Article 25 as a provision that applies also to all design obligations that are forced by the DSA itself, then this could become an indirect instrument how to enforce the DSA. So for instance, the DSA prescribes that submission interfaces have to be user-friendly, right? So if you submit a notification, it has to be user-friendly interface. Well, is non-user-friendly interface a violation of Article 25 potentially? And if yes, then Article 25 could become a vehicle how to enforce some of these more design-oriented obligations in the DSA for content moderation and related things. But it's not going to go into the space of risk management. That's going to stay mostly in the area of public enforcement.
Okay. Thank you, Martin. So now we have clear kind of an interesting relationship between the DSA and the UCPD. And I turn to Anne-Jel Hoelen here from the Dutch ACM to ask your thoughts on the interrelationship, the relationship between the DSA and the UCPD, because it seems to me that there's a potential tension for regulating dark patterns now.
Well, I have. Thank you. I have to answer that the Article 25 DSA is not yet completely clear.
Right.
So there is still some discussion on the interpretation and how to interpret, how you should interpret the exception to the ban of the use of dark patterns in DSA. So first, you have this very literal and broad interpretation, and this is what we just hit. Yeah, under this interpretation, all practices that are governed under the GDPR or the UCPD are excluded from the prohibition of Article 25. So, as long as a practice can be considered as a commercial practice or involves the processing of personal information, this prohibition would not apply. And the prohibition would effectively cover B2B practices only, and maybe a very small subset of B2C practices that do not involve the processing of personal information or do not constitute a commercial practice. So the literal wording really points towards this direction, but there's an alternative interpretation as well, and that's a more narrow interpretation, making Article 25 a fallback prohibition, and the exclusion could also be interpreted as meaning that it only covers practices that are not prohibited by the UCPD or the GDPR. So, for example, practices conducted by online platform that could be considered as a commercial practice, but as not necessarily an unfair commercial practice, distorting the economic behavior of consumers within the meaning of the UCPD, or that is also the blacklist of the UCPD in the annex of the UCPD. Or, and that, still could be prohibited under Article 25. So, and maybe there are even more interpretations.
Sure. I have my own third interpretation, but so in my opening, it's great that you're here because it's a voice of sort of reason from the regulator. But it's when we think about deceptive design, I was reminded last night that we've had deceptive design long before Harry coined the term in 2010, and we could go back to the Roman times, I think, and look at influencers and persuasion, and in reality, even before the UCPD, we had the misleading advertising and marketing regime as well. And these were all about regulating marketplaces long before we'd come up with terms like dark patterns and surface-free design and haptic devices or haptic technologies, etc. And these had all entered our sort of mainstream vernacular. But from a consumer protection perspective, are there any technological neutral lessons to be learned from this history of regulating deceptive patterns or deceptive design?
Yeah, going back to the Roman marketplace.
Yeah.
So what we would say, to summarize it briefly, it would be just like, thou should not mislead, thou should not act aggressively, and act according to professional diligence. So yeah, that's to summarize it.
Okay, so if I could just play counter narrative to that. Right. If everybody is designing a platform with deceptive designs, with maybe the exception of Harry and maybe the exception of Colin Gray, who's sitting 2/3 of the way back, isn't the standard of platform designed to be deceptive? So how can you argue that professional diligence is the test if the professional standard is at present to be deceptive?
Yeah.
No,
so
an
okay.
idea.
Yes, professional diligence means that you have to meet the standards of the sector, and the standards of the sector are constructed by, for example, codes of conduct.
Right.
But if the codes of conduct are not followed, or the bar is set too low, then you have a correction by fair market practices. So there's a correction in the definition of professional diligence. So I think if a whole sector is misleading, then that's definitely a breach of fair marketing practices.
Okay. But when it comes down to the UCPD, that's only one test that you have to pass, isn't it? So we'd also have to identify who the average consumer is, whether they made a transactional decision, again, the standard of professional diligence, and that takes time. So we could have a kind of loophole here within the DSA and the UCPD framework that a platform designs something deceptively. It is ultimately to make a consumer enter into a transaction that they wouldn't have done otherwise. When the DSC, the Digital Services Coordinator in a member state, approaches them and says, hey, you've got a dark pattern, they could say with a straight face, well, it might be a dark pattern, but it's a UCPD dark pattern, and it's outside the scope of the DSA, because they know that you guys, through no fault of your own, are going to take quite a bit of time trying to solve those tests. So that's my third interpretation of what Article 25 might amount to. But when you have that kind of inherent subjectivity that's in whether a deceptive design causes, especially if we're moving towards personalized choice architecture that's powered by AI systems, that are powered by algorithms, that are using profiling, deep beneath in the system architecture, surely there's almost a role for technology in detecting dark patterns. I mean, if we're not coders, if we're not with the exception of some of the designers in the room, if we're not able to kind of look at something and inherently understand where the deception is because it's not in the online interface, do we have a gaping hole that can only be rectified by technology itself? Is that a fair question?
Yeah. We should be able to use check to find dark patterns in the underlying layer, if that's what you mean.
Yeah.
And it will be a tech race. And of course, as an authority, we're trying to keep up, right?
Yeah.
So nowadays we've got these data scientists, we've got engineers, and we are developing tools, designing tools, keeping up with all developments. But on the other hand, we have only so much capacity. So it's all the time, it's a challenge. So I think what's very important is cooperation. Cooperation with other authorities of a different kind. For example, as the Authority for Consumers and Markets, we work together with other authorities like the media regulator and the Dutch DPA. We develop tools together with the Consumer Protection Cooperation Network on a European level. We have a e-lab on a European level. We also work together with academia, which is really great. And for example, now we also have an MTech project going on, but I also know that Silvia has some really nice plans we're very interested in. So that's I think the solution should be found that way.
That way, okay. So, I go back to Harry's comments earlier about, I don't want to put words in Harry's mouth about using the phrase online interface as maybe being ill-founded in today's climate, and Dr. de Conca's suggestion that these things were kind of creeping into non-traditional surface-free devices. So I guess the pending question for all of us is the design acquis of the European Union sufficient enough to regulate new forms of deceptive design? And unfortunately, in the paper that Christiana and I have written, the word online interfaces appears in the DSA, it appears in the DMA, it appears in the Data Act, it appears in the GDPR, or it doesn't appear in the GDPR, take that back, and it appears in the AI Act, but through kind of a non-traditional means. So we're now stuck with an entire body of law that kind of looks at the online interface as being the thing that you're going to look for, the dark patterns. But we now have increasing evidence that dark patterns are actually being embedded inside the system's architecture beneath. And so we might argue that we're not sufficiently prepared to regulate the second wave of deceptive design. So at this point, I'm going to open the microphone to anybody in the audience that wants to come ask questions. And if you could identify yourself and your organization. Oh, here we go, Colin Gray. Welcome. Colin. The microphone is not on. It is now.
Okay, thank
Great.
you. Colin Gray, Purdue University. Thank you so much for the panel. This has been really useful and enlightening. I am obviously coming at this from a design and social science perspective and not as much from the legal perspective, but I am very interested in sort of thinking more broadly about how we can construe interface as a term and how we can maybe expand its meaning. I appreciate Harry's perspective, but also I think the term interface can mean something much broader than just UI elements on a screen. And in fact, some classic design theory definitions of interface would talk about any surface on which interaction takes place. And surface there means anything. So it's your voice, it's haptics, it's your body, whatever. And so I think my question for Harry, and I think a couple of the others as well, is maybe to think about what have we learned over the last 5 years as we've really built out a pretty substantial typology and ontology of dark patterns at multiple scales, many of which are domain and context agnostic. And what can we learn from some of those lessons that might be able to help us proactively identify where dark patterns might emerge in some of these other contexts, like VUIs, but also robots or other conversational user interface contexts?
If I could start with an answer, maybe give Harry some time to come up with something. But Harry and I started working on this website called Deceptive.design, which you're all welcome to go if you haven't already heard of it. And one of the things that we learned from that, or we did in that, was to try and do an analysis of all the enforcement decisions around the EU, some cases in America, certainly the UK as well, where the regulator had brought in an action against a platform that had used a dark pattern. And then Christiana and I's work was analyzing those judgments because they never use the dark pattern by name. They never say, oh, it's nagging or coercion or it's harassment. And all of those decisions are up on that website as we speak now, which is a great resource for anybody interested in Deceptive.design. Great website name as well. What we've learned is that regulators have only really brought actions against the obvious dark patterns, right? We only see enforcement decisions against the common in-your-face dark patterns where very few system architecture dark patterns or experts like yourself have come in. Overwhelmingly, they are visible dark patterns, the things that are above the surface. Think about the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg. That's where enforcement has resided primarily so far. I think that's a lesson in that it's a starting point for enforcing dark patterns, but it also shows that there's a bit of a problem. I think Christiana's, in our paper, we make the argument that, and I'm speaking for you, so correct me, Christiana, but one of the things that might benefit everybody, including designers, is if enforcement bodies would name the dark pattern so that we have consistency in language in their enforcement rulings. That's one thing that we've learned on top of this analysis of enforcement rulings. And I think the other thing that I would add, as somebody that's been looking at this for a while, is that there is a real shortcoming in understanding designers. And designers don't understand the law, but the lawyers and the policymakers don't understand design. And that's something that we're starting to see, cooperative agreements with, work with yourself and Harry as well. But we really need to move up that dialogue so that people can really understand what it means to design something in a way that brings about a deceptive practice which manifests itself on what you would say is the online interface, or what we've traditionally called the online interface. But Harry, did you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question that Colin asked, so I don't have a particularly detailed answer. But I mean, in my view, yeah, a lot of types of the dark patterns that have already been articulated apply to non-screen interfaces like voice. So Colin's taxonomy, the great stuff, is all good for alternative interfaces like nagging. We all know nagging started with voice in the first place anyway. Then we talked about it on screen. It works for voice and screen or whatever else comes next. But the stuff, I suppose I'm just kind of going along with what you said there, Mark, the stuff about the kind of inner system, like what order search results appear in e-commerce or how social feeds get presented, the way in which that order is defined, the way in which it's personalized. In my mind, there's a bit of a gap there, or at least I'd like to see more research and more understanding on that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's what I have to say.
Did you have anything on this?
I would like to point out, as pure legal scholar and, if you will, also a bit of a traditional one, you can have a broader or narrower definition of interface that can include profiling, for example, or how the system, the more layers of the system architecture, let's put it that way. It might not mean that that is can be operationalized for the law, and it can happen that then nuances will get lost in the translation into a legal concept. Because one of the biggest puzzles for me to solve right now when I'm researching deceptive design is how to make sure that the interaction of deceptive design with profiling and with the structure of a smart home, for example, but even without the device, is actually still possible to regulate by the law without becoming a mayhem or a diabolical task for judges, or worse, for the damaged parties. So I wouldn't be surprised if the loss in translation could be significant, and the law might just adjust itself on through a series of case law on a slightly less ideal way to approach this, but that works for the parties involved and works for the purpose of the law.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so one thing, just in closing, I think to link together is really those low-level UI dark patterns that we've been talking about for a really long time. The code-level dark patterns, which are the manifestation, in the near term, but also the temporal experience, and these system architecture issues, which I've increasingly talked about as part of the socio-technical landscape. Yeah. And all these things have to be linked together. Otherwise, I don't think we make a very compelling case why these are deceptive practices in the first place.
Okay, thanks, Colin. Mr. Migliora.
Hi, I'm Guilherme Migliora from Leiden University. I have two very brief questions. The first one to Martin. He was saying that the provisions on Article 25 and the provisions on, I don't know if he's still there.
So Martin, can you switch to Martin, please?
Yes, I managed to reconnect.
Okay.
Okay. He said that those are not applicable only to consumers, but also to business. And he said, maybe we don't have a way to distinguish how it would apply to one and to the other. And at least in Brazil, the way that we deal with consumer law and also with several matters in labor law is that you look to the power imbalance. And I wanted to ask you if you think that the power imbalance is a good measurement to understand to what extent it would apply similarly to businesses as it would to consumers. And then on a second, very short question, I wanted to ask Silvia. I know that this was discussed in another conference, and you guys were talking about what fundamental rights could be applicable in the situation of personal assistance and etc. And I just wanted to get your take on the application of the right of freedom of thought and the whole discussion on the development of a new jurisprudence and case law within the European framework that would base that on. Thank you.
So we'll go to Martin first to tackle that one.
Thank you for that question, and sorry. We've lost electricity. Can you imagine that? So I'm on a phone. In any case, most definitely, I think even within the notion of consumer, you intuitively distinguish, right? So if the relevant consumer is a child, then there's a very different type of anticipation of what can be manipulative. Same thing if compared to, say, adults. So I think it makes a lot of sense to factor in things like, what's the bargaining position, of that individual, and how much they can actually afford to, reject certain things or go back and redo transactions. So I think certainly those things should sort of play a role. I've seen some people arguing that we should have a little bit more granular sort of distinctions between different types of actors. So users shouldn't be only consumers and businesses, but things in between. And I think that intuitively makes a lot of sense. Ultimately, though, we need to develop a kind of a typology of who these entities are, how they're behaving, and what do we find to be appropriate for them to be exposed to. And I think this is where I don't think we have much of experience, because B2B space is generally not, beyond deception, misrepresentation, is not very harmonized. So I think this is a big, an interesting, exciting sort of new area where we can have a lot of interesting conversations. But most definitely, I think those kind of factors can factor into the debate.
So can I just say, I've already been flashed the 5-minute warning here. So can I at least hear your question to see if we can maybe tie it together to some of the other,
Sure.
to the previous
So
question?
My question is short. It's around standardization, because DSA does say that the Commission might come up with standards for online interfaces. That's the term it uses. In a lot of consumer laws, such as food laws, for example, we see standards on the font size, color to be used, at least in several jurisdictions, like India has them. So do you think it will be effective if they have a template, a literal template with colors, font, everything, for basic things where dark patterns are most commonly found? Do you think that would be effective, especially in light with business practices also?
I'm going to hand that question over to Anne-Jel, because I know you want to talk about the fitness check, and that might fall into there as well. And then if we have time, I'll come back to the freedom of thought question.
Yeah, well, I just want to stress, I hope I don't, I just want to stress that at this moment there's a fitness check going on of the on a digital fairness of the EU consumer acquis. So there's a paper of the Netherlands Authority for Consumers and Markets that's also stressing that certain elements and effects of dark patterns, for example, should be taken in account next to, for example, economic harm, but also, for example, stress and emotional distress and attention that is taken from you and time. And we also ask for a longer list with a longer blacklist of unfair commercial practices. So, yeah, I think that's, but it's, limited time.
Yeah, it's just my own thinking on the iconography is that we did have an experiment with this with the GDPR, and I don't think it really went anywhere. So, and it might infringe on a business's autonomy to design their platforms as they see fit, as long as it's within the law. We do have a couple minutes left. Sorry.
For the icons in relation to the dark patterns, I think the next pattern would be that the icon doesn't is not included, right? Or ways to disguise the the icon.
Right.
And I think it's very important to stress that we already tried the icons at the GDPR, and now again there's a new generation that's trying to advocate again for icons. But yeah, I'm a bit skeptical, to be honest.
Yeah. So we do have a little bit of time. Do you want to try the freedom of thought
the
question?
answer to the freedom of thought is very simple, and only case law will tell. Because we can put forward a possible interpretation of that article. Mark already has, and we align on that. But somebody has to sacrifice and bring the case in front of the European Court of Justice or the European Court for Human Rights. Yep. And not only one case, because one case is only going to create more papers by us, but or a couple more panels. But we need quite some consistent case law that is going to take years, and maybe we will get there at some point. Who knows?
Right. So absent any further or last questions, thank you everybody for coming to hear us out, especially in this last panel of the day. I know it's been a long day for everybody, but thank you. And I want to say a particular thank you to the people who have given up a little bit of their time to join us online. Harry Brignull, Martin Husovec, To my right, we have Anne-Jel Hoelen and Silvia de Conca, my colleague at VU. Thank you, everybody.
I'd like to thank... 1 second. I would really like to thank Sarah Eskens for organizing this panel and putting a lot of her time and effort and making it possible for us to talk. Thank you. And thank you, Mark, for moderating so well.
Thank you.